Hello, NLCP. This is Ms. Bustos, and we are going to read together The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So each week, I'm going to do a video where I read out loud the week's reading. So each day we're reading 9-10 pages, and then I'll do that for each week that we're reading for our first one book, one NLCP. So here we go. The Exam. On January 29, 1951, David Lack sat behind the wheel of his old Buick watching the rain fall. He was parked under a towering oak tree outside Johns Hopkins Hospital with 3 of his children, 2 still in diapers, waiting for their mother, Henrietta. A few minutes earlier, she jumped out of the car, pulled her jacket over her head, and scurried into the hospital past the colored bathroom, the only one she was allowed to use. In the next building, under an elegant domed copper roof, a 10.5-foot marble statue of Jesus stood, arms spread wide, holding court over what was once the main entrance of Hopkins. No one in Henrietta's family ever saw a Hopkins doctor without visiting that Jesus statue, laying flowers at his feet, saying a prayer, and rubbing his big toe for good luck. But that day, Henrietta didn't stop. She went straight to the waiting room of the gynecology clinic, a wide open space empty but for rows of long, straight back benches that looked like church pews. "I got a knot in my womb," she told the receptionist. "The doctor need to have a look." For more than a year, Henrietta had been telling her closest girlfriend something didn't feel right. One night after dinner, she sat on her bed with her cousin Margaret and Sadie and told them, "I got a knot inside me." "A what?" Sadie asked. "A knot," she said. "It hurt something awful. When that man want to get with me, sweet Jesus, there are but more pains." When sex first started hurting, she thought it had something to do with baby Deborah, who she'd just given birth to a few weeks earlier, or the bad blood David sometimes brought home after nights with other women, the kind doctors treated with shots of penicillin and heavy metals. Henrietta grabbed her cousin's hands one at a time and guided them to her belly, just as she'd done when Deborah started kicking. "You feel anything?" The cousins pressed their fingers into her stomach again and again. "I don't know," Sadie said. "Maybe you're pregnant outside your womb. You know that can happen." "I'm no kind of pregnant," Henrietta said. "It's a knot." "Henny, you got to get that checked. What if it's something bad?" But Henrietta didn't go to the doctor, and the cousin didn't tell anyone what she'd said in the bedroom. In those days, people didn't talk about things like cancer. But Sadie always figured Henrietta kept it secret because she was afraid a doctor would take her womb and make her stop having children. About a week after telling her cousin she thought something was wrong, at the age of 29, Henrietta turned up pregnant with Joe, her 5th child. Sadie and Margaret told Henrietta that the pain probably had something to do with the baby after all, but Henrietta still said no. "It was there before the baby," she told them. "It's something else." They all stopped talking about the knot, and no one told Henrietta's husband anything about it. Then, 4.5 months later, after baby Joseph was born, Henrietta went to the bathroom and found blood spotting her underwear when it wasn't her time of the month. She filled her bathtub, lowered herself into the warm water, and spread her legs. With the door closed to her children, husband, and cousins, Henrietta slid a finger inside herself and rubbed it across her cervix until she found what she somehow knew she'd find, a hard lump deep inside, as though someone had lodged a marble just to the left of the opening to her womb. Henrietta climbed out of the bathtub, dried herself off, and dressed. Then she told her husband, "You better take me to the doctor. I'm bleeding and it ain't my time." Her local doctor took one look inside her, saw the lump, and figured it was a sore from syphilis. But the lump tested negative for syphilis. So he told Henrietta she'd better go to Johns Hopkins Gynecology Clinic. Hopkins was one of the top hospitals in the country. It was built in 1889 as a charity hospital for the sick and poor, and it covered more than a dozen acres where a cemetery and insane asylum once sat in East Baltimore. The public wards at Hopkins were filled with patients, most of them black, and unable to pay their medical bills. David drove Henrietta nearly 20 miles to get there, not because they preferred it, but because it was the only major hospital for miles and treated black patients. This was the era of Jim Crow. When black people showed up at white-only hospitals, the staff was likely to send them away, even if it meant they might die in the parking lot. Even Hopkins, which did treat black patients, segregated them in colored wards and had colored-only fountains. So when the nurse called Henrietta from the waiting room, she led her through a single door to a colored-only exam room, one in a long row of rooms divided by clear glass walls that let nurses see from one side to the next. Henrietta undressed, wrapped herself in a starched white hospital gown, and lay down on a wooden exam table, waiting for Howard Jones, the gynecologist on duty. Jones was thin and graying. His deep voice softened by a faint southern accent. When he walked into the room, Henrietta told him about the lump. Before examining her, he flipped through her chart, a quick sketch of her life, and a litany of untreated conditions. 6th or 7th grade education, housewife and mother of 5. Breathing difficult since childhood due to recurrent throat infections and deviated septum in patient's nose. Physician recommended surgical repair. Patient declined. Patient had one toothache for nearly 5 years. Tooth eventually extracted with several others. Only anxiety is oldest daughter who is epileptic and can't talk. Happy household. Very occasional drinker. Has not traveled. Well-nourished, cooperative. Patient was one of 10 siblings. 1 died of car accident, 1 from rheumatic heart, 1 was poisoned. Unexplained vaginal bleeding and blood in urine during last 2 pregnancies. Physician recommended sickle cell test. Patient declined. Been with husband since age 15 and has no liking for sexual intercourse. Patient has asymptomatic neurosyphilis but canceled syphilis treatments. Said she felt fine. 2 months prior to current visit, after delivery of 5th child, patient has significant blood in urine. Tests show area of increased cellular activity in the cervix. Physician recommended diagnostics and referred to specialist for ruling out infection or cancer. Patient canceled appointment. 1 month prior to current visit, patient tested positive for gonorrhea. Patient recalled to clinic for treatment. No response. It was no surprise that she hadn't come back all those times for follow-ups. For Henrietta, walking into Hopkins was like entering a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She knew about harvesting tobacco and butchering a pig, but she never heard of words like cervix or biopsy. She didn't read or write much, and she hadn't studied science in school. She, like most black patients, only went to Hopkins when she thought she had no choice. Jones listened as Henrietta told him about the pain, the blood. She says that she knew there was something wrong with the neck of her womb, he wrote later. When asked why she knew it, she said that she felt as if there was a lump there. I do not quite know what she means by this, unless she actually palpitated this area. Henrietta lay back at the table, feet pressed hard in stirrups, as she stared at the ceiling, and sure enough, Jones found a lump exactly where she said it would be. He described as an eroded, hard mass about the size of a nickel. If her cervix has a clock face, the lump was at 4 o'clock. He'd seen easily 1,000 cervical cancer lesions, but never anything like this. Shiny and purple, like grape jello, he wrote later, and so delicate it bled at the slightest touch. Jones cut a small sample and sent it to pathology lab down the hall for a diagnosis. Then he told Henrietta to go home. Soon after Jones sat down and dictated notes about Henrietta and her diagnosis, her history is interesting in that she has a term delivery here at the hospital. September 19, 1950, he said. No note is made in the history at that time or at the 6 weeks return visit that there is any abnormality of the cervix. Yet here she was 3 months later with a full-fledged tumor. Either her doctor had missed it during her last exams, which seemed impossible, or it had grown at a terrifying rate. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant in Roanoke, Virginia on August 1st, 1920. No one knows how she became Henrietta. A midwife named Fanny delivered her into a small shack on a dead-end road overlooking a train depot where hundreds of freight cars came and went each day. Henrietta shared the house with her parents and 8 older siblings until 1924, when her mother, Eliza Lacks Pleasant, died giving birth to her 10th child. Henrietta's father, Johnny Pleasant, was a squat man who hobbled around on a cane he often hit people with. Family lore has it that he killed his own brother for trying to get fresh with Eliza. Johnny didn't have the patience for raising children, so when Eliza died, he took them all back to Clover, Virginia, where his family still farmed the tobacco fields their ancestors had worked as slaves. No one in Clover could take all 10 children or relatives, divide them up, one with this cousin, one with that aunt. Henrietta ended up with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks. Tommy lived in what everyone called the home house, a 4-room log cabin that once served as slave quarters, with plank floors, gas lanterns, and water Henrietta hauled up a long hill from the creek. The home house stood on a hillside where wind whipped through cracks in the walls. The air inside stayed so cool that when relatives died, the family kept their corpses in the front hallway for days so people could visit and pay respects. Then they buried them in the cemetery out back. Henrietta's grandfather was always raising another grandchild that one of his daughters had left behind after delivering him on the home house floor. That child's name was David Lacks, but everyone called him Day because in the Lacks country drawl, house sounds like heis and David sounds like day. Young Day was what the Lacks family called a sneak baby. A man named Johnny Coleman had passed through town 9 months later. Day arrived. A 12-year-old cousin and midwife named Munchie delivered him. Blue as a stormy sky and not breathing, a white doctor came to the home house with his derby and walking stick, wrote stillborn on Day's birth certificate, then drove his house-drawn buggy back to town, leaving a cloud of red dust behind. Munchie prayed as he rode away. Lord, I know you didn't mean to take the baby. She washed Day in a tub of warm water, then put him on a white sheet where she rubbed and patted his chest until he gasped for breath and his blue skin warmed to soft brown. By the time Johnny Pleasant slipped Henrietta off to live with Grandpa Tommy, she was 4 and Day was almost 9. No one could have guessed she'd spend the rest of her life with Day. First a cousin, growing up in their grandfather's home, then as his wife. As children, Henrietta and Day awoke each morning at 4 o'clock to milk the cow and feed the chickens, hogs, and horses. They tended a garden filled with corn, peanuts, and greens, then headed to the tobacco field with their cousin Cliff, Fred, Sadie, Margaret, and a horde of others. They spent much of their young lives stooped in those fields, planting tobacco behind mule-drawn plows. Each harvest, they pulled the wide leaves from their stalks and tied them into small bundles, their fingers raw and sticky with nicotine resin. Then climbed the rafters of their grandfather's tobacco barn to hang bundle after bundle for curing. Each summer day, they prayed for a storm to cool their skin from the burning sun. When they got one, they'd scream and run through the fields, snatching armfuls of ripe fruit and walnuts that the wind blew from the trees. Like most young Laxes, Day didn't finish school. He stopped in the 4th grade because the family needed him to work the fields, but Henrietta stayed until the 6th grade. During the school year, after taking care of the garden and livestock each morning, she walked 2 miles past the white school where children threw rocks and taunted her, to the colored school, a 3-room wooden farmhouse hidden under tall shade trees, with a yard out front where Mrs. Coleman made the boys and girls play on separate slides. When school let out each day, and any time it wasn't in session, Henrietta was in the fields with Day and the cousins. If the weather was nice, when they finished working, the cousins ran straight to the swimming hole they made each year by damming the creek behind the house with rocks, sticks, bags of sand, and anything else they could sink. They threw rocks to scare away the poisonous cottonmouth snakes, then dropped into the water from tree branches or dove from muddy banks. At nightfall, they built fires with pieces of old shoes to keep the mosquitoes away, and watched the stars from beneath the big oak tree where they'd hung a rope to swing from. They played tag, ring around the rosy, and hopscotch, and danced around the field singing until Grandpa Tommy yelled for everyone to go to bed. Each night, piles of cousins packed into the crawl space above a little wooden kitchen house just a few feet from the home house. They lay one next to each other telling stories about the headless tobacco farmer who roamed the streets at night, or the man with no eyes who lived up the creek. They slept until their grandmother Chloe fired up the wood stove below and woke them up to the smell of fresh biscuits. One evening each month during harvest season, Grandpa Tommy hitched the horses after supper and readied them to ride into the town of South Boston, home of the nation's second largest tobacco market, with tobacco parades, a Miss Tobacco pageant, and a port where boats collected the dried leaves for people around the world to smoke. Before leaving home, Tommy would call for the young cousins, who'd nestle into the flat wagon on a bed of tobacco leaves, then fight sleep as long as they could before giving in to the rhythm of the horses. Like farmers from all over Virginia, Tommy Lax and the grandchildren rode through the night to bring their crops to South Boston, where they line up at dawn, one wagon behind the next, waiting for the enormous green wooden gates of the auction warehouse to open. When they arrived, Henrietta and the cousins would help unhitch the horses and fill their troughs with grain, then unload the family's tobacco onto the wood plank floors of the warehouse. The auctioneer rattled off numbers, each echoed through the huge open room, its ceiling nearly 30 feet high and covered with skylights, blackened by years of dirt. As Tommy Lax stood by his crop, praying for a good price, Henrietta and the cousins rode around the tobacco piles, talking in a fast gibberish to sound like the auctioneer. At night, they'd help Tommy haul any unsold tobacco down to the basement, where he'd turn the leaves into a bed for the children. White farmers slept upstairs in lofts and private rooms. Black farmers slept in the dark underbelly of the warehouse with the horses, mules, and dogs on a dusty dirt floor lined with rows of wooden stalls for livestock. The mountains of empty liquor bottles piled almost to the ceiling. Night at the warehouse was a time of booze, gambling, prostitution, and occasional murders, as farmers burned their own season's earnings. From their bed of leaves, the Lax children would stare at ceiling beams the size of trees as they drifted off to the sound of laughter and clinking bottles and the smell of dried tobacco. In the morning, they'd pile into the wagon with their unsold harvest and set out on the long journey home. Any cousins who'd stayed behind in Clover knew a wagon ride into South Boston meant treats for everyone. A hunk of cheese, maybe, or a slab of bologna. So they waited for hours on Main Street to follow the wagon up to the home house. Clover's wide, dusty Main Street was full of Model A's and wagons pulled by mules and horses. Old Man Snow had the first tractor in town, and he drove it to the store like it was a car. Newspaper tucked under his arm, his hounds, Cadillac and Dan, baying beside him. Main Street had a music, theater, bank, jewelry store, doctor's office, hardware store, and several churches. When the weather was good, white men with suspenders, top hats, and long cigars, everyone from mayor to doctor to undertaker, stood along Main Street sipping whiskey from juice bottles, talking or playing checkers on the wooden barrels in front of the pharmacy. Their wives gossiped at the general store as their babies slept in a row on the counter, headrests on long bolts of fabrics. Henrietta and her cousins would hire themselves out to those white folks, pulling their tobacco for 10 cents so they'd have money to see their favorite Buck Jones cowboy movies. The theater owner showed silent black and white films, and his wife played along on the piano. She knew only one song, so she played happy carnival-style music for every scene, even when characters were getting shot and dying. The lax children sat up in the colored section next to the projector, which clicked like a metronome throughout the whole movie. As Henrietta and Day grew older, they traded Ring Around the Rosie for horse races along the dirt road that ran the length of what used to be the Lax Tobacco Plantation, but was now simply called Laxtown. The boys always fought over who got to ride Charlie Horse, Grandpa Tommy's tall bay, which could outrun any other horse in Clover. Henrietta and the other girls watched from the hillside on the back of straw-filled wagons, hopping up and down, clapping and screaming as the boys streaked by on horseback. Henrietta often yelled for Day, but sometimes she cheered for another cousin, Crazy Joe Grinnin. Crazy Joe was what their cousin Cliff called an over-average man. Tall, husky, and strong, with dark skin, a sharp nose, and so much thick black hair covered his head, arms, backs, and neck that he had to shave his whole body in the summer to keep from burning up. They called him Crazy Joe because he was so in love with Henrietta, he'd do anything to get her attention. She was the prettiest girl in Laxtown, with her beautiful smile and walnut eyes. The first time Crazy Joe tried to kill himself over Henrietta, he ran circles around her in the middle of winter while she was on her way home from school. He begged her for a date, saying, "Honey, come on, just give me one chance." When she laughed and said no, Crazy Joe ran and jumped straight through the ice of a frozen pond and refused to come out until she agreed to go with him. All the cousins teased Joe, saying maybe he thought that ice water might have cooled him off, but he's so hot for her. That water nearly started boiling. Henrietta's cousin Sadie, who was Crazy Joe's sister, yelled at him, "Man, you so much in love with the girl, you gonna die for her? That ain't right." No one knew what happened between Henrietta and Crazy Joe, except that there were some dates and some kisses, but Henrietta and Day had been sharing a bedroom since she was 4. So what happened next didn't surprise anyone. They started having children together. Their son Lawrence was born just months after Henrietta's 14th birthday. His sister, Lucille Elise Pleasant, came along 4 years later. They were both born on the floor of the home house, like their father, grandmother, and grandfather before. People wouldn't use words like epilepsy, mental retardation, neurosyphilis to describe Elsie's condition until years later. To the world so fast, Day hadn't even gotten back with the midwife when Elsie's shot right out and hit her head on the floor. And everyone would say, maybe that was what left her mind like an infant's. The old dusty record books from Henrietta's church were filled with the names of women cast from the congregation for bearing children out of wedlock. But for some reason, Henrietta never was. Even as rumors floated around Laxtown that maybe Crazy Joe had fathered one of her children. When Crazy Joe found out Henrietta was going to marry Day, he stabbed himself in the chest with an old dull pocket knife. His father found him lying drunk in the yard, shirt soaked with blood. He tried to stop the bleeding, but Joe fought him, thrashing and punching, which just made him bleed more. Eventually, Joe's father wrestled him into the car, tied him tight to the door, and drove to the doctor. When Joe got home all bandaged up, Sadie just kept saying, all that to stop Henny from marrying Day? But Crazy Joe wasn't the only one trying to stop the marriage. Henrietta's sister Gladys was always saying Henrietta could do better. When most Laxes talked about Henrietta and Day and their early life in Clover, it sounded as idyllic as a fairy tale. But not Gladys. No one knew why she was so against the marriage. Some folks said Gladys was just jealous because Henrietta was prettier. But Gladys always insisted Day would be a no-good husband. Henrietta and Day married alone at their preacher's house on April 10th, 1941. She was 20, he was 25. They didn't go on a honeymoon because there was too much work to do and no money for travel. By winter, the United States was at war and tobacco companies were supplying free cigarettes to soldiers, so the market was booming. But as large farms flourished, the small ones struggled. Henrietta and Day were lucky if they sold enough tobacco each season to feed the family and plant the next crop. So after their wedding, Day went back to gripping the splintered ends of his old wood plow as Henrietta followed close behind, pushing a homemade wheelbarrow and dropping tobacco seeds into holes in a freshly turned red dirt. Then one afternoon, at the end of 1941, their cousin, Fred Garrett, came barreling down the dirt road beside their field. He was just back from Baltimore for a visit in his slick 36 Chevy and fancy clothes. Only a year earlier, Fred and his brother Cliff had been tobacco farmers. Ooh. In Clover 2. And that is where we end for Monday.